On August 6, 1945, the morning began like any other in Hiroshima, with the quiet hum of life moving through the city. People walked the streets, the sun's rays cutting through the mist that instant. It all stopped. A flash, so bright and intense that it turned the very sky white, swallowed the morning whole. For a moment, there was no light, no shadow, just an all-encompassing brilliance, as if the sun itself had exploded. And then, just as quickly as it clung to the rooftops, casting long shadows over the bustling markets. The familiar sounds of the city filled the air. Conversations, distant trains, the clatter of streetcars. But then, in came the flash was gone. The city was gone. What had once been a thriving metropolis, a city of 350,000 souls, now lay in complete and utter silence. And for those 500 miles away in Tokyo, there was only confusion. The telephone lines went dead. The radio stations fell silent. There was no warning, no explanation, only an eerie, suffocating silence. The city, Hiroshima, had vanished in the blink of an eye. No one knew what had happened, but they all felt the weight of the impossible, as if the very laws of nature had been broken. The reports filtered in, each one more fragmented and bewildering than the last. General Tanaka paced across the war room, his eyes darting over the scattered documents, trying to piece together a coherent explanation. The evidence was undeniable. Hiroshima had been destroyed. But how? The generals in Tokyo had lived through years of air raids, bombings, and destruction, but nothing could prepare them for this. One bomber, one bomb. The idea was absurd, impossible. Colonel Arakawa, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak. His voice steady but laced with frustration. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his finger tapping against the map of Hiroshima, the ink still fresh from the last reconnaissance mission. One bomber, one bomb. It defies everything we know about aerial warfare. No weapon in the world has that kind of power. His eyes scanned the room, challenging anyone to argue. He couldn't accept it. Not yet. The officers nodded in agreement. They had witnessed bombings before, entire cities razed by waves of bombers. But this? One plane, one bomb. That kind of destruction was beyond the realm of possibility. Arakawa's theory, the only one that made sense to him, was that it must have been a lucky strike, a single bomb hitting the central communications hub, or an accident. It was the only logical explanation. The Americans had their psychological warfare tactics, after all. Perhaps they were attempting to induce panic, to destabilize Japan's resolve. But as each new report trickled in, that explanation began to lose its weight. One report described the eerie cloud rising from Hiroshima, a perfect mushroom shape that climbed into the sky, taller than any storm cloud. The description was vague, but enough to make the officers pause. Another report came in from a nearby train station. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat was unbearable, even from a distance. A shock wave had leveled everything in its path, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Telephone poles had snapped. Buildings had crumbled. The scientific community had no answers. No one could fathom the scale of what had just happened. But then a single report arrived that stopped everything cold. A lone witness, an officer stationed 30 kilometers outside Hiroshima, had written an urgent, frantic message. He had seen the flash, felt the shockwave. He had seen the mushroom cloud rise above the city, just like a weapon he'd read about but never believed could be real. A new type of bomb. The words were barely legible, scrawled hastily across the page. The officer had written and rewritten them several times, as if trying to make sense of them himself. General Tanaka stood still, staring at the paper, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't believe it, not at first. But there it was in black and white. The pattern of destruction, the flash, the heat, the cloud, could only mean one thing. This was no ordinary bomb. This was something far more terrifying. Something that could level a city in a single blow. Arakawa's confident dismissal faltered. He stood, his mind racing as the implications sank in. No, it's not possible. We would have seen this coming. he muttered. But his voice lacked the certainty it once had. He had seen the reports, the first-hand accounts. He had seen the devastation. And deep down, he knew that something had shifted. They were no longer dealing with conventional warfare. The silence in the room deepened, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, no one spoke. No one could bring themselves to say it out loud. But the truth hung in the air like a thick fog. This wasn't just an ordinary weapon. This wasn't a bomb they had prepared for. The very nature of warfare had just changed before their eyes. As the final reports arrived, the scientific community's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't a bomb at all. Not in the traditional sense. This was something else entirely. It was a new kind of weapon, one that defied everything they knew about destruction. A weapon that could obliterate a city, its people, its entire existence with a single strike. And the worst part? It wasn't just Hiroshima. Could happen again. And again. The generals, once so confident in their strength, their strategy, now stood on the precipice of an unthinkable reality. They had just witnessed the dawn of a new age of warfare, one they could not fight. The room was heavy with the weight of silence. The officers sat in stillness, their eyes glued to the reports scattered across the table, each one more incomprehensible than the last. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, weighed down by the enormity of what had happened. Is there any city left to defend? General Tanaka's voice was barely above a whisper, but the question hung in the room, echoing through the minds of every man present. There were no answers, no way to comprehend the destruction that had just occurred. Hiroshima, the very heart of Japan, had been wiped from the map. The reports kept coming, each one describing a landscape that was no longer a city, but a ghost, a place where no life remained, no structure stood. The streets were empty, the buildings nothing but rubble, and the sky itself seemed to mourn the loss. Even the rivers, usually so full of life, were silent. Major Kotaro, a young officer with the courage to see the destruction firsthand, had been dispatched to verify the reports. His plane had left hours earlier, heading toward the ruins of Hiroshima. The wait in the war room felt like an eternity, each minute stretching into an endless abyss. Finally, Kotaro's transmission came through, but it was not the confirmation anyone had hoped for. His voice crackled over the radio, strained and taut, carrying the gravity of what he had seen. It's gone, sir. Hiroshima is gone. I can see the outline of the rivers. The bridges are still there, but everything else, it's flattened. There's nothing left above ground. Not a building. Not a single sign of life. His words cut through the tension like a blade. There was no hope left. The city, the bustling hub of 350,000 people, was no more. The landscape that had once been filled with life was now barren, a wasteland of twisted metal and smoldering ash. The silence in the room deepened as each officer processed the weight of Kotaro's report. How could they fight a war when one of their greatest cities had disappeared in a single moment? How could they defend their nation when their strongest symbols of resistance had been reduced to nothing? The generals exchanged glances, each face a mask of disbelief. Colonel Arakawa's brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile what he had heard with what he knew of warfare. He had seen devastation before, but nothing like this. The words on the papers no longer made sense. The strategies they had spent years developing seemed irrelevant now. The enemy had introduced something new, something so powerful that it had obliterated Hiroshima without warning, without mercy. What could they possibly do in the face of such power? Kotaro's report only deepened the paralysis in the room. The emotional toll of the news was undeniable. Some men stared at the table, lost in thought. Others gripped the arms of their chairs, as if the weight of their decisions was too much to bear. And yet, even as the realization of their helplessness settled in, there was still a flicker of resistance. General Anami, the strongest voice for continuing the war, clenched his jaw and stood up, his back straight as he turned toward the others. This is a setback, but we are not finished yet. We can still fight. His voice rang with determination, but it was clear that even he was struggling to hold onto his confidence. His words were a lifeline to those who refused to accept the truth, that their world had changed forever. They could fight on the beaches, in the mountains, in the cities. They could hold on to their honor. They had no choice. But the truth was beginning to settle into the fabric of their thoughts. How could they fight when one bomb could erase a city so completely? Major Kotaro's words still echoed in their ears. There's nothing left above ground. A ghost city, devoid of life, devoid of hope. The officers, once resolute in their commitment to victory, now sat in stunned silence, each man weighed down by a crushing uncertainty. The war they had known was no longer a war they could win. The weapons they had prepared for were no longer the ones they faced. The very nature of their enemy had shifted, and no one knew how to fight this new battle. As the minutes dragged on, the generals found themselves staring at one another, unable to voice the growing doubt that filled the room. Was it possible to continue? Was there any hope left? The weight of the decision was suffocating. Could they really keep fighting, knowing that one bomb could end everything? And so, as the chapter closes, the leaders of Japan are left in a moment of stark truth, staring at the remnants of Hiroshima in their minds. The war had entered a new and terrifying phase, a phase in which the future of their nation was no longer certain. The silence of Hiroshima hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on the minds of the officers in Tokyo. It was a silence unlike anything they had ever known, a silence born from a death so complete, so thorough, that it seemed to permeate everything. No city, no people, no buildings, no hum of life. Just an empty space where a vibrant metropolis had once stood. It was as though the land itself had swallowed the city whole, leaving nothing behind but echoes of the unthinkable. General Tanaka sat at the head of the table, his hands folded tightly together as he stared at the map in front of him. The outlines of Hiroshima's streets, now only faint shadows on the paper, seemed to mock him. What could they do when the very earth refused to answer? What could they fight against when the city had been wiped from existence in a single moment? The question reverberated in his mind. How can this happen? His officers, their faces pale and drawn, exchanged uneasy glances. No one knew how to respond. Their minds were racing, scrambling for a theory that could explain the impossible. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Perhaps a rogue bomber had dropped a new type of weapon, something they hadn't anticipated, but even that explanation seemed inadequate. No bomb, no matter how powerful, could produce this level of devastation, could erase a city so completely. Colonel Arakawa stood, pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back as he muttered to himself. This doesn't make sense. We've fought through firebombing raids that turned entire cities to ash. But this is something else. His voice trailed off as he struggled to find a way to explain it. A single bomb? One bomber? Impossible. Despite his own skepticism, Arakawa had seen the reports. He had heard the accounts from the survivors, from the military patrols stationed at the outskirts of the city. Every description painted the same horrific picture. A flash of blinding light, a mushroom-shaped cloud rising into the sky, and then a city that was simply no more. The reports spoke of survivors with burns so severe, they were unrecognizable. Of people who had been standing with their backs to the blast, only to have their skin seared on one side, as if the very light of the explosion had burned through them. Even the ground was scorched, rivers boiled, trees were charred to the bone, and the earth itself had become a barren wasteland. The reports didn't just describe physical destruction. They spoke of a new kind of death, one that didn't just kill but radiated, a death that lingered, invisible but lethal. Survivors who had escaped the initial blast had begun to suffer from a strange illness. Vomiting, hair falling out, skin sloughing off in sheets. The medical officers had no explanation for it. No conventional weapon could cause this kind of devastation. No bomb could produce such lasting effects. Could this be some new kind of chemical weapon? Major Kotaro asked, his voice weak. His own experience in Hiroshima had left him shaken, unable to reconcile the horror of what he had witnessed with the conventional warfare they knew. No, General Tanaka responded, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't chemical. Something else. This is something beyond us. His words hung in the air, heavy with dread. And then, as if summoned by their collective desperation, a new voice entered the room. Yoshio Nisha, one of Japan's leading physicists, was brought in to make sense of the impossible. He had been following the reports from Hiroshima, studying the photographs, the descriptions, and the medical data. His mind had already begun to piece together the terrifying truth, but he had not yet spoken of it to anyone. As Nisha entered the war room, his presence seemed to shift the atmosphere. He was a quiet man, unassuming in appearance, but his reputation preceded him. He had studied atomic theory under the great minds of Europe, and his research had explored the boundaries of nuclear physics. He had always considered atomic fission a distant possibility, a theory too complex, too far out of reach for the current world. But as he looked at the devastation, his mind raced with a horrifying realization. The generals watched him carefully as he set down his papers. Nisha glanced at the map of Hiroshima, then at the reports stacked on the table, and for the first time, the officers saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like fear. "This, what we're seeing?" Nisha began slowly, his voice calm but laced with gravity. "It's not just a bombing. It's not conventional warfare. What we're dealing with is something much more powerful. Something destructive." A wave of disbelief passed over the room. Arakawa's skepticism flared up once more, and he interrupted. "What do you mean? How could this possibly be? What could destroy an entire city with such precision?" Nisha turned to face him. "It's not a single bomb, Colonel. It's a new kind of weapon. A weapon based on atomic fission, the splitting of atoms. The kind of energy that powers the stars themselves. The kind of energy I thought was still decades away from realization." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "But it's real. The explosion, the flash, the mushroom cloud, the radiation burns, these are all signs of atomic fission." The room went silent. The realization was slow, like a creeping fog, but it settled in with a suffocating certainty. Atomic fission. The words seemed to carry an almost mythical quality, an unimaginable force now unleashed. Nisha's voice broke through the silence again, quieter this time, tinged with sorrow. "I never thought it would come this soon. This is no longer a conventional war. What we've seen is the future of warfare, and we're completely unprepared for it." The officers sat still, their faces pale, as the reality of Nisha's words took root. It was no longer just a question of strategy or tactics. This was a war against something that defied comprehension. The power to wipe out a city in a single moment, to alter the very fabric of life itself with a weapon so potent that nothing they had could stop it. The war they knew, one of soldiers, of bombs, of battlefields, had just ended. They were facing a new kind of weapon, a new kind of destruction. And at that moment they were powerless. The chapter closed as the officers exchanged looks, no longer certain how to continue. The silence of Hiroshima wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the quiet before an irreversible storm. A storm that no one in that room had been prepared for. The high command was still reeling from the reports, the weight of Hiroshima's destruction hanging heavily in the air. The generals had debated all day, each argument more desperate than the last. Colonel Arakawa, still holding on to his conviction, had insisted that the enemy's tactics were psychological. "We cannot allow ourselves to be fooled by such a display," he had said. "It's a bluff, a deception. This is nothing more than a morale tactic." But even his own words sounded hollow now. The evidence was too overwhelming, too real. In the midst of their indecision, Yoshio Nisha entered the room. His presence, calm and composed, contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in the minds of the generals. He had spent the entire day reviewing reports, the photographs of Hiroshima, the survivor testimonies, the medical reports, and most crucially, the scientific data. What he had discovered left him no room for doubt. He wasn't here to offer hope. He was here to deliver a painful truth. Standing before the table, Nisha took a deep breath before speaking. "What you've witnessed in Hiroshima is not the result of an ordinary bomb. This was the work of atomic fission, a process by which the nucleus of an atom is split, releasing an unimaginable amount of energy. The flash you saw, the heat that radiated out, and the cloud that followed, these are all signatures of a new kind of weapon. A weapon that is far beyond anything we have encountered. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The generals were silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The blast, the explosion you saw, was not a bomb in the conventional sense. It was an atomic reaction, an instantaneous release of energy that can obliterate everything in its path. Colonel Arakawa opened his mouth to speak but stopped short, his voice faltering. But this is impossible. No one has the ability to create such a weapon. Nisha met his gaze. It is not impossible, Colonel. It's real, and it has already been used. The city of Hiroshima is gone because of it. There is no longer any question of what we are facing. The power of atomic energy is beyond our comprehension, and our defenses, our strategies, are powerless against it. The room grew colder, the words hanging heavily in the air. Nisha continued, describing in meticulous detail the mechanics of atomic fission. The release of energy from splitting uranium atoms, the chain reaction that escalates the destruction with each split, and the terrifying speed with which the explosion takes place. The intensity of the blast, he explained, was so great that even the ground itself was scorched, unable to support life for miles around. The burns described by the survivors, he said, were not from conventional fires but from radiation, the kind that would continue to kill long after the initial flash. As Nisha spoke, the generals exchanged glances, their faces drawn with dread. The weight of his analysis shattered the last vestiges of their illusions. They had hoped, desperately, that this was a miscalculation, that Hiroshima was an anomaly. But there was no doubt now. Japan was facing something far worse than they had ever imagined. This wasn't just a bomb. This was the dawn of a new era in warfare. An era where cities could be destroyed with a single strike. Major Kotaro, who had seen the destruction firsthand, could barely keep his composure. His mind had been trying to make sense of it all, but Nisha's explanation brought clarity, and with it, an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "We have no defense against this," he whispered, almost to himself. Nisha's voice was quiet but firm as he addressed the room. "No, Major, we have no defense. And if the enemy has more of these weapons, we will lose our cities one by one." Hiroshima was just the beginning. The truth hit the officers like a wave. They were no longer just fighting a war. They were fighting against something that could erase them completely. One bomb, one city, gone. What could they do when a single bomb could reduce everything they held dear to dust? They had never imagined a war like this. A war where survival wasn't about strategy or tactics, but about whether they could prevent the complete annihilation of their nation. The room fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. The generals knew now that they were standing at the edge of an abyss. And this time there was no going back. The debate raged on, but the generals knew that something had shifted. The uncertainty was too overwhelming, and their resolve, once as firm as stone, was beginning to fracture. They had never faced a choice like this before. To continue the fight meant risking the complete extinction of their nation. But to surrender meant dishonor. The once unthinkable reality of losing the war was now on the table, and the cost of survival seemed too high. General Anami, ever the fierce advocate for military resistance, slammed his fist onto the table. "We cannot surrender," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Our honor, the lives of our soldiers, the sacrifices of every man who has died, do they mean nothing? We cannot let this bomb dictate our future. We will not give in to fear." But his voice, usually so commanding, now sounded like a last, desperate cry. The weight of his words settled in the room, but they were met with growing doubt. General Yumizu, who had long advocated for Japan's superiority, remained silent. His eyes were fixed on the map of the homeland, but his mind was elsewhere. Even he could no longer ignore the truth. Foreign Minister Togo, his face drawn, spoke with a calm that contrasted sharply with the rising tension. What good is our honor when our cities are being wiped from the map? What good is resistance when one bomb can destroy everything we've worked for? We must face reality. If we continue to fight, we will lose everything. We cannot afford to wait for the next bomb to fall. We must consider surrender. The room fell quiet as his words sank in. Surrender. The word felt foreign on their tongues, but it was the only option left. Japan's military strength was no match for the atomic bomb. The battlefield had changed, and they had no way of fighting back. Still, some officers held onto their pride. "We cannot surrender," Colonel Arakawa said, his voice shaking but firm. "We must fight. We must bleed them dry until they negotiate. Our soldiers, they gave their lives believing this was worth it. To give up now is to dishonor them." But even Arakawa's words seemed weak now. The generals were no longer speaking about tactics or strategy. They were speaking about survival, and each one knew deep down that the choice was no longer in their hands. The high command was at a crossroads. The next few days will determine the future of Japan. Would they continue to fight, knowing they faced annihilation? Or would they surrender and preserve what little remained? The tension in the room was unbearable as the generals exchanged glances. Each one of them was weighing the cost, but the price of continuing the fight was becoming clear. The chapter closed on a chilling realization. Japan had run out of options. The only decision left was whether to end the war before the bombers returned, or to risk everything for the sake of honor. The choice, however impossible, would soon be made. And for the first time in the war, it felt as though Japan's fate was no longer in their hands. The news arrived quietly, almost like a whisper in the chaos of Japan's high command, but it hit with the force of a hammer. Nagasaki is gone. The words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Another bomb, another city erased. The second strike confirmed what everyone had feared. Hiroshima wasn't an accident, a one-off disaster. This was a strategy. The Americans had more bombs, and they were not bluffing. General Tanaka gripped the edges of the map in front of him, his knuckles white. The pages trembled under his fingers, as if the reality of it was too much to hold. How many more cities would they lose? The thought was paralyzing. The war, once a battle of strength and will, had shifted into something entirely different, something Japan had no defense against. The first bomb had been unimaginable. But now there was no question. They were facing the annihilation of their cities, their people, and everything they had fought to protect. The room was silent for a long time, each officer lost in their thoughts. Major Kotaro, who had witnessed the horrors of Hiroshima and had seen the remnants of Nagasaki through the scattered reports, finally spoke. "We're next," he muttered almost to himself. "How much longer before they come to Tokyo? Osaka? Kyoto?" His voice was strained, and he didn't wait for an answer. They all knew. With the second bomb dropped and the Americans showing no sign of stopping, panic began to set in. The high command now faced a truth they could no longer deny. America had the power to erase them, city by city. General Umezu, ever the optimist, struggled to maintain his composure, but even he could not mask the dread creeping into his words. "We must have miscalculated," he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. "They cannot have more. This is all they have." But the grim looks from the other officers told him what his mind refused to accept. They were wrong. America had not only perfected the atomic bomb, but they had more of them. And each bomb was a death sentence for another Japanese city. Foreign Minister Togo's face was drawn as he addressed the group. "How many more cities must be destroyed before we accept the inevitable? How many more lives must we lose to this new weapon?" His voice was quiet, weary. "We're not fighting an army anymore. We're fighting a force of nature, a weapon that can obliterate everything in its path, without a single soldier having to step foot on the ground." There were no arguments, no defenses left. The generals could no longer deny the truth. Japan's survival was no longer in their hands. The chapter ended with the realization settling over them like a suffocating fog. One more bomb. Two more. How many before there is nothing left to defend? And the worst part? There was no answer. With the second bomb and the Soviet invasion now looming, Japan stood on the edge of a precipice. The leaders of the High Command had never faced such a dire situation. To continue fighting meant facing the annihilation of their cities, their people. To surrender meant losing everything: honor, dignity, and the soul of their nation. The debate in the war room was no longer about strategy or victory. It was about survival. Foreign Minister Togo's voice broke through the heated arguments. "We must end this. It's over. There is nothing left. The Soviet Union is advancing from the north, and we are already losing our cities to atomic bombs. To continue the fight is to sign our own death warrant." Navy Minister Yonai, who had long argued for a more pragmatic approach, stood beside him. "We cannot fight both the Soviets and the Americans, not with this new weapon in their hands. They have the power to erase us one city at a time, and we have no defense against it. We must surrender to preserve what little we have left." But General Anami, still clinging to the old ideals of military honor, stood firm. "We cannot surrender. Our soldiers have died believing that their sacrifice meant something. If we surrender, we dishonor them. We dishonor all of Japan's dead." His words hung in the air, but the more he spoke, the more hollow they seemed. The officers could see it. The resistance was no longer based on any real hope of victory. It was based on a refusal to accept the impossible reality. They were already defeated. As the tension in the room grew unbearable, a decision was made that would change the course of history. A summons was sent to the Emperor, who alone had the authority to break the deadlock. The Emperor's voice would be the final word on whether Japan would continue the fight to its destruction or choose survival through surrender. The chapter ended with a sense of finality. As the war room grew silent in anticipation, the Emperor would decide the fate of Japan. The doors to the war room opened, and for the first time in the entire war, the Emperor Hirohito himself entered. His presence was commanding, and his silence was profound. The room, filled with officers and generals, fell into an uneasy stillness. For the first time, the men who had steered Japan through years of war were no longer in control. The Emperor's voice would decide their fate. Hirohito's gaze swept across the room, his expression unreadable. The tension was palpable. The men who had spent their lives planning military strategy, defending Japan's honor, now stood before him as if waiting for a final judgment. "I have heard all of your arguments," the Emperor said softly, but with unmistakable authority. "But the reality of our situation is clear. Hiroshima is gone. Nagasaki is gone. And the Soviets are advancing from the north. We have no more cities to defend. The war is lost. There is only one choice left." His words cut through the room like a blade. For the generals who had spent years believing in the sanctity of their cause, the Emperor's declaration was both a relief and a crushing blow. There was no victory left to fight for, no last-ditch effort to turn the tide. The Emperor's decision was final. "We will surrender," Hirohito said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a nation's future. "We will preserve what is left of Japan. We will end this war." The room was still for a long time after that. The High Command, who had resisted the idea of surrender with every ounce of their being, now stood in the presence of a truth they could no longer deny. The Emperor had spoken. The chapter ended with the generals, once so proud, now bowing their heads in silent agreement. The war was over. The surrender was signed, and Japan entered a new era, one not shaped by victory or military might, but by the cold reality of survival. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shattered Japan's military, its will, and its soul. The old Japan, once proud and unyielding, had died in those blinding flashes of light. Some generals could not accept the new world that had been forced upon them. In the days following the surrender, several committed suicide, unable to bear the shame of defeat. Their deaths were symbolic of the old Japan, the Japan that could no longer survive in a world shaped by atomic power. For those who remained, the task of rebuilding was both physical and psychological. The cities were gone, and the national psyche was broken. Japan would rise again, but it would never be the same. The old ideals of honor, of sacrifice, would give way to a new reality: survival at any cost. As the war ended, the officers and generals who once commanded battles and armies now found themselves in a world where their strategies no longer mattered. Japan had surrendered, not because it was conquered by soldiers, but because it had been erased by a weapon more powerful than anything they could have imagined. The atomic age had begun, and with it, the dawning realization that the future of warfare and the future of humanity would never be the same. In the aftermath, a young officer walked through the now empty war room, where the maps still covered the walls, and stopped in front of a map of Hiroshima. He stared at the outline of the city, the once vibrant city now marked only by a red circle, the radius of destruction. He spoke quietly, his words a somber reflection of everything that had changed. A city disappeared, he said, and with it the old Japan. The world, too, had changed forever.